Hello, and welcome to the Banff at Altitude podcast, celebrating 50 years of adventure storytelling from the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival. Since its beginning in 1976, the Banff Centre Mountain Film and Book Festival has been a gathering place in celebration of all things mountain culture. The yearly festival, hosted at Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity, fosters an appreciation of the world's mountain places by creating opportunities for people to share and find inspiration in mountain experiences, ideas, and visions. Over the years, we've spoken to hundreds of incredible adventurers who share their spectacular and moving stories. My name is Joanna Croston, and I'm going to be digging through our festival archives to revive some of our favorite presentations from the past to get you stoked for what's to come in 2025, our 50th anniversary. And well, hopefully you'll be stoked for life in general. In continuing with this tradition of sharing stories and connections, we hope this podcast will inspire you to explore, preserve, and enjoy the great outdoors. At the 2024 festival, we had the joy of bringing Cory Richards back to Banff to talk about his book, The Color of Everything. Cory is joined by fellow alpinist Jack Tackle to dive into Cory's career as a renowned climber and National Geographic photographer. In both his book and his talk, Cory looks back at success and what the cost of fame means while trying to deal with mental health and addiction. In this episode, Cory and Jack talk about the darker side of trauma. A note to listeners, some content deals with issues that are related to drugs, trauma, and suicide. In conversation with Jack Tackle, this is Cory Richards at the Max Bell Auditorium in Banff.
We've got two fine-looking people up here already posed. You probably thought you were getting one. You're getting two for the price of one today. And a bit of a backstory. A number of years ago, I played with the idea that I was going to become an ice climber. So I signed up for an introduction course at the Canmore Ice Climbing Festival. And I found out that my instructor was going to be Jack Tackle. And I thought, holy crap. I mean, I knew the reputation. I knew the stuff he had done in Alaska, his reputation about extreme alpinism. I thought, man, if you want to learn from somebody, this is the guy to learn from. I then played with a bit of a fantasy in my head that I would have been so good as an ice climber that he would have invited me on his next trip. This is the first time we've seen each other since the 2000s. So, to introduce Cory, please welcome Jack Tackle.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's great to see so many people I know and people I don't know either. So, introducing Cory here, I just want to cover some bases here. Many of you know about his acclaimed accomplishments as both a National Geographic photographer and a mountain climber. But actually today, we're going to be exploring a much more in-depth and personal account of his journey through life with his mental health challenges. Cory was diagnosed with bipolar II disorder at the age of 14, and we will be talking about his ensuing journey for the last 30 years to accept and understand what this has meant for his progression as a photographer, as an alpinist, and now as a writer. The title of Cory's memoir, The Color of Everything, I'll leave that for you to discover what that means. But the subtitle, which is The Journey to Quiet the Chaos Within, will be the core of our conversation today. At the risk of being a little redundant for everyone here, Cory is still the only North American climber to have climbed an 8,000-meter peak in the winter, with his ascent of Gasherbrum II in 2011, with Simone Mora and Dennis Durubko, both of which have been here at Banff. Their subsequent epic descent of G2 involving being caught and buried in an avalanche is well documented in Cory's film, Cold, which won the grand prize here at Banff in 2011. This near-death experience resulted in the self-portrait of Cory featured on the 125th anniversary edition of National Geographic in 2012, which launched and solidified his professional photography career. Later that year, he was chosen by National Geographic as the Adventurer of the Year. 2 years later, he was also awarded the National Geographic Photography Fellow in 2014, which came in the midst of his 12 different featured published assignments for National Geographic. Later on, Cory climbed the North Ridge of Everest without oxygen in 2016, and again in 2017 in supporting his friend Adrian Ballinger. They both climbed the North Ridge, Adrian without oxygen. I've known Cory peripherally through the years as a friend because he lives in Bozeman, which is my hometown. But when I agreed to take on this interview with Cory, I knew he was an acclaimed photographer, a strong climber, but I didn't know the depth and the complexity of his mental health challenges. The Color of Everything is written with courage, vulnerability, and an exceptional insight. Please welcome Cory Richards. So we're done, right?
We're done.
Yeah, okay.
Let's go out and have a drink.
Yeah.
No.
All right. So I want to say when I first got the call from Joanna Croston to do this, or asked me if I would do it, I was a little daunted by the challenge.
I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a dig.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to start with is a quote of yours, which is, "In order to escape madness, I will live madly. I will risk my life in order to save it." So when did you first say that to yourself and first write that?
If you broke the book up into a 3-act structure, that is the end of Act 1, where if you look at sort of a hero's journey structure, that's where somebody is invited into the unknown. But to say that I knew I was making that decision at the time would be complete and total bullshit. I was literally trying to find a way to outrun what had happened in my adolescence, which was everything from being put in psychiatric hospitals to long-term treatment facilities to running away to all this stuff. And I was just, because of that chaos, there was a sense of comfort in chaos. And because I'd started climbing young, it was something I knew. And so the high stimulus environment, just worked.
So you don't remember exactly when you wrote that down the
Well, I
first time?
wrote it down when I was, I think 2 years ago, when I was like, oh shit,
Yeah.
this is what I was doing. But yeah, I didn't,
All right, well, let's talk about that phase of things. When did you actually decide to write this book, and why did you decide to write this book?
I decided to write the book 3 years ago, and I feel like it was partly in response to that I didn't know who I was anymore. It came on the heels of leaving a huge expedition and sort of leaving photography and climbing fairly publicly, and just being like, this doesn't work anymore. It was a reaction to a sort of formlessness that I had stepped into and trying to make sense of, if I'm not these things, who the fuck am I? You know what I mean?
Yeah. When we were talking about this earlier, you mentioned that you decided you needed an exorcism.
Yeah.
And it was for you to start with, but the book then became for others. So I want you to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was very, I will say honestly, it was very self-indulgent at first, and I didn't know that, I couldn't see it, but I was writing, and I was writing very much from a place of victimhood. But through that process and rereading it and starting to see like, oh, wow, these are the stories that I'm telling about myself. No wonder I feel so terrible inside. So as I started to step out of that victimhood and I started to step out of the stories and I started to get more and more honest about all of it internally, it became less about me. And towards the end, as I was finishing it, I was like, oh, this isn't about me at all, actually. I don't even want it to be about me. I want it to be a gift. Even if people had no relatable necessarily experience like climbing Everest or anything, that's not what it's about. That is all just a vehicle. My hope is that people would just feel seen in it. That was the biggest. I never wanted it to be about adventure. I never wanted it to be about climbing mountains. I never wanted it to be about any of that. Had I been able to leave that out, I would have, but that was my life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, one of my questions that you just made me think about was there's a whole lot of stuff in this book. It's sort of a tell-all.
Yeah.
So it begs the question, what did you leave out?
Wouldn't you like to know?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no. It's salacious enough.
It's
What
only-
more do you want,
I know,
right?
that's the basis of my question. There's 350 pages of going, Jesus.
Right.
Jesus. You know, what? Wow. Well, we'll talk about that later then. So, but, seriously, the first part of the book, you talk obviously a lot about your childhood and your family and all that. And, we could go on for 3 hours about just that part.
Yeah.
So in just a few minutes, how would you describe the process you went through as an adolescent and a teenager, getting you to the point where then you started seriously climbing, and how that affected the rest of your life?
In essence, I started climbing when I was very young, 5 years old, skiing and climbing, 2 years old, 5 years old. And it was sort of an Eden-esque childhood. We were very much an outdoors family, and there was a lot of joy in that. And then adolescence rolled around, and by virtue of the relationship at home, specifically with my brother, there was some violence and some trauma and abuse that was starting to happen, and that's deeply explored in the book. And I went to high school 2 years early, and after those 2 years, I went from getting straight A's to basically failing out. Everybody was aware that something was very, very wrong. We couldn't piece it together at the time, but I ended up in a psychiatric hospital. And then immediately after, I was put in long-term inpatient, outpatient care for 8 months. That was where I was diagnosed with bipolar. I was heavily medicated. I ran away 3 times. On the last time, my parents were like, fuck it, we don't know what to do. We love you, but you can't. And so I was homeless for a time.
And this is in Salt Lake.
This is in Salt Lake City.
Right.
And oftentimes taken in by friends, but there were times where I was squatting, and there's some dark, specifically chapter 8 is a pretty dark chapter that talks about that experience. And then I was hospitalized again when I was 17 years old. And finally, it was like the first time I remember somebody being like, Cory, what do you want? It was like the first time somebody asked me what I needed. What do you need? Rather than telling me what I needed, this prescriptive thing. And I ended up in Seattle, and that's where life started to straighten out a little bit again and come back together, because I think I started to rediscover climbing.
So when you got to Seattle, I think that's where you first met Steve Swenson and Ann, is that right?
I met Steve and Ann when I was 8. We were in the Wind Rivers. Steve was climbing with George Lowe, and Dr. George's dad, was there. My dad and George Lowe were best friends. And I remember we'd go fishing, and one night they were like, Dr. George was feeding us all of the guts of the fish that we had caught that day. And he's like, no, that's how the natives did it. And all of these guys were just laughing at all the kids shoving fish guts in their mouth. So that's traumatic. I need some therapy for it.
Sounds really traumatic.
I've been trying to work that out ever since. No.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Well, at any rate, at some point you went to Seattle, and then you ended up actually coming up here
Yeah.
and living in the Bow Valley
Yeah. I came up
for 4 or 5 years.
4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
I lived in Steve and Ann's house when they bought it.
Right.
And rent felt expensive at like $300. I was like, how am I going to do this?
So in that next phase of your climbing, because you really hadn't started the photography thing yet, right? So you got a bit of a reputation here in the valley for going out, maybe doing something that might have been a little above your head, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you remember the phrase, little whipper bitch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which became your moniker.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I was for sure thought that came from Kevin Doyle.
No.
But in fact, it was Bubba.
It was Barry Blanchard. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, really.
So during that time,
Yeah.
you were obviously climbing a fair amount, but you were getting asked to go climbing with some well-known, very experienced people, maybe more experienced than yourself, because you were starting to be well known as a good photographer. And if person X, who was sponsored, got to go climbing with you and you took photos, you know, so it became that kind of thing. But what else did you learn that you value now from this time in the bow, from your climbing, that helped you then further develop your climbing beyond here?
I think there's something very special about this place as far as climbing goes. I mean, if we're just talking about the activity, I don't think there's a better place in the world to learn how to become a fierce alpinist. And I was never very good at hard alpine climbing, but I tried hard. And I think there's a certain level of tenacity that's required in this place, and that's the only thing that really allows you to climb anything hard in general, is the willingness to go again and again and again. And I think that's also written into alpinism in general, but I would say that that was also part of my own internal willingness to suffer, if that makes any sense. There's almost a sense that I liked it. I liked sort of the self-punishment of it all.
Especially ice climbing in the winter, right?
Especially ice climbing in the winter. And
taking 100-foot falls.
100-foot falls, that was where the little whipper bitch,
Going to the hospital.
Going to the hospital in the back of the car
Bailing
with
on
Raph.
Insurance bills.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
There's a whole history here. I think it might be illegal that I'm here. There might be some unpaid bills at the hospital still.
Yeah, right. Well, they'll find you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, from there, seriously though, all of us that started climbing and progressed and saw different places and different experiences helped lay the groundwork for future climbing. So after you left the bow, what was the next thing that started happening between climbing and photography for you?
Well, I mean, there was this really interesting point where, and again, if I peel this back and I look at my life through the lens of the book, there was a moment where it was obvious that the Bow Valley had expired in some ways. I was trying to outgrow it, and I could have stayed here and climbed forever, right? And many people are very happy doing that. I wanted to go do bigger and bigger things. And so I started spending summers basically in Peru, in Cordillera Blanca, in Huaraz, and trying to sort of sharpen my teeth to try to do bigger and bigger things. Because the goal for me was always going to the Himalaya. That was always where I wanted to be. And there's a number of different reasons for that. I think one of them was that all of this stuff that had happened in my adolescence had me kind of believing that there was a lack of value to me. And that's really deeply explored in the book, but this idea that there was a value deficit, that somehow I didn't really matter. And I think that I was trying to stake my claim in the world through photography and climbing, because I could hold a picture and I could be like, see, I fucking matter. And I thought that by doing that, the bigger, the better, the harder, the more I would matter, right? And to some degree, it's kind of true, at least on a surface level. But what I was really looking for in all of that was something deeper. Right. So I started going to Peru, and then I started going to the Himalaya directly thereafter.
Right. And right before you got invited to go to Gasherbrum 2 in the winter, you told me you climbed Lhotse. You did a couple other 6,000-meter peaks in Nepal, but that was it. And so you get the call from Simone Moro. Why do you think he asked you, first of all?
I have no fucking idea. I honestly don't. I think... But
you talk about the fact that he wanted to have a movie made and he wanted photography for the sponsors, right?
Well, he wanted he wanted somebody who had the dual skill set, right? And I was newer on the North Face team at that point, and we just liked each other. He actually met Simone when I was climbing with Ines Papert, the first time I went to Nepal. And we just liked each other. So when he called and asked, I had no idea really what I was getting into. I had no clue. I just said yes.
And it became a good idea, but we're going to talk a little bit more about deeper parts of what happened there.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I know we've never talked about this before.
Yeah, okay.
But before we talk about that, just who were the photographers that you looked up to for influence when you were first starting?
So many people, they have this revisionist history where once they've learned about photography, then they start to throw out the names, the obscure names, because it makes them sound cool. Oh, these were my big inspirations. Jack asked me, and I was like, Cory Rich, Jimmy Chin. right? Like those were the people I knew. I didn't know any of these big names that like, and then certainly, you know, you peel it one layer back where it's like, okay, and then you learn about Ansel Adams. And then if you're lucky, you learn about Brad Washburn.
Right.
But I didn't really learn about photography in like the big world until much, much later. So my inspirations initially were Cory Rich and Jimmy Chin.
And it was just Climbing Magazine.
It was just Climbing Magazine.
And Rock and Ice.
And
right?
Rock and Ice. And
Right.
that's what it,
Yeah.
and now I could list the names of people that you've never heard of to sound really smart. And they're all inspirational, but like, yeah.
Well, one of the things I thought in your book, with respect to photography, I think the 4 strongest words you wrote in the book, which were repeated over and over.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm going to say?
No, I have no idea.
Good.
No idea.
You would be describing a situation, describing where you were and who you were with, and all of a sudden you would just simply say, I take a picture.
Yeah.
I thought that was a fantastic piece of punctuation. And you say it over and over again. Really an important segue into talking about the importance of photography for you and the people you were with, right? So after that, and we'll talk about this in a second here, but you made the quote, I'll never make a transcendent picture, but there will be one powerful enough to exalt and destroy me. And that's where we come to Gasherbrum 2 in the winter, right? So I'm assuming a lot of people here have seen the movie Cold and know about this story. It's a fairly educated audience, but in case you hadn't, you guys, Dennis Rupko, you and Simone Moreau, climbed Gasherbrum 2 in the winter of 2011. And one of the things I found interesting from re-watching the film was you have a quote in the movie that said, climbing set me straight. So you said that 13 years ago. How do you feel about that statement now?
I think climbing set me straight for a time. I think it was useful. I think it was beautiful. I think it was generative. And then climbing became a cage, which I think is so fascinating that I kept going to bigger and bigger places. And ultimately, it became a smaller and smaller and smaller cage that I couldn't get out of because I was anchoring myself to an activity. I was anchoring myself to the idea of what it means to be a climber, or like just that word, like, you know, exploration, explorer, I'm a photographer, and ultimately it wasn't represented, it was hollow. And I also found that it was fairly one-dimensional. Not to say that if you identify as a climber, that's one-dimensional. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying for me, I felt like I was shrinking. So it was beautiful. It was absolutely a stunning, astonishing, beautiful modality and way for me to see the world, and I am so grateful. And I was aching to not be a climber by the time I left it all behind.
So we're still in 2011, 2012 time frame here. So on the descent from Gasherbrum 2, the 3 of you are caught in this avalanche, which is where the
photo comes
comes from. In the film, I'm watching that again. We see the picture, if you
The
will.
picture.
Yeah. But one of the things that struck me was, and I'm sure, you know, and there's a number of people here in the audience that have experienced this. I've experienced it. A number of us have been buried in avalanches and survived and dug ourselves out. Right? So what do you think was different for you in terms of how violently you reacted to the avalanche and the subsequent time after that?
Well, again, this moment in my life, the moment of the avalanche, the photo, it's its own identity that can be very, very seductive, and I've gotten trapped in it in the past. But it also launched me into really learning about the brain and psychology and mental health. And one of the things that's very, very curious about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is we don't really know why some people react more strongly than others. But what we know is that if you have complex post-traumatic stress from tumultuous traumatic childhoods, you're more likely to have an acute episode of PTSD. So coming from my background, it makes perfect sense why I would react more strongly than, say, somebody who didn't have that same kind of upbringing, that same kind of chaos in their upbringing. But there's a direct link between historical trauma, developmental trauma,
Right.
and the likelihood of PTSD.
Well, I know you've talked about this a lot, but I thought it was important to just at least touch on it for a few minutes, because it leads to what you did the next year. You went to Everest with Conrad to the
Right.
West Ridge and had an anxiety attack.
Right, right.
So in the process of trying to be involved with big mountains,
Yeah,
like Everest, turns out it's big,
turns out.
and continue to feed the engine for your professional photography career.
Yeah,
In my view of the world,
yeah,
there's two H's that are really important in my view, and they're sort of bookends.
yeah,
One is hubris,
yeah,
and the other is humility, right? And hubris kills. In the case of humility, the leadership and vision that comes through reaching a point of having humility, I think, is super valuable and important. But I'd like to hear your view of how you dealt with the hubris and if you ever got to the humility part.
Well, if you're asking if I ever got there, I've probably fucked it up. I will just say this, broadly speaking, I was a deeply arrogant human for a very long time. And that was a mask for the deep sense of, like, I didn't matter as a human. And so I built a strong sense of, like, a strong outward projection to hide that deep insecurity. And that drive to matter through action and through creation, which is somewhat normal. When that got so big that I got lost behind it, that's when I sort of lost myself in the hubris of things. And that's also why I like Bubba, when he, little whipper bitch, it's funny, but also it was because I was way above my pay grade with these guys. And the fact that they even had me there, like, with them is kind of mind-blowing. I did not have the technical skill to be climbing with a lot of my heroes at that point. I just didn't. And so I was always outpacing myself. And there's a piece of that grandiosity that's very much tied to bipolar. The idea that you can just do and be anything is very real. But what I started to realize is that there's a lot of false humility in climbing in general, and people are like, oh, the mountain humbled me. And you're in the moment of talking about this huge storm that you survived. And I'm looking at it now, and maybe this is just me, but it's like, you don't really seem that humble right now. You're talking about how radical you are for surviving the big storm, and you're like, oh, I was so humbled up there. And you're like, huh, that's curious. Like, I don't hear. But I think humility, I would like to think that I'm moving out of that hubris stage. The need to talk about it is less important. Like, I just kind of don't care. And I don't mean that in like a dismissive way. I just don't care.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit more about climbing, and then we'll move on to...
Yeah, because I don't care. No, I'm just kidding.
You don't give a shit, so I'm not going to ask anymore.
No, I'm totally kidding.
Oh, good. Well, we're done.
Yeah.
All right. So I asked you about, who you looked up to in photography. And I know when you started climbing, it was with your father. Mm-hmm. And just for some people that don't know, Cory's father's best friend was George Lowe. And so besides your dad and George, who else did you look up to as you really started, in your teens, starting to develop more technical climbing skills?
George, Steve, because I met Steve when I was so young. And then there was people that I had read about, that my dad had read to us about, from Bonington to Kurt Dienberger, Boardman and Tasker, and these huge names. But they were all sort of mythological. But then there was this reality where there were these mythological beings that were larger than life that were still living, like Steve House and Mark Twight and Barry, and these people doing these big, amazing ascents that I was reading about that were all centered here. And so then I got here, and I remember going to Barry's house for the first time, and I was legitimately nervous, because to me at the time, this is like the king of alpine climbing, the grand poobah, you're right. Just like, and then there's you. And so there were the people that I came in contact with really quickly. There were the people that I knew from childhood. And then there were the Lauritans and the Twillet and the Mesners. So.
Well, I thought it was a good segue to then start talking a little bit more about some other things that might be a little more interesting for you.
No, trust me, I love talking about climbing. I'm just giving shit.
One of the reticence I had when I got the call from Joanna, as I mentioned earlier, was, I look at your Instagram, I look at all this stuff in social media, and my first thought was, how do I deal with this narcissistic personality, right? But then I talked to you a couple times, and I thought, all right, it's like looking at an 8,000-foot face that's a new route, and I'll just, go up there and figure it out.
Figure it out, piece by piece.
But more importantly, the last time we had a full conversation of any serious note was at our house in Bozeman in 2017, when you came over and you had just climbed Everest, the North Ridge, without oxygen. You were preparing to go back and do it again with Adrian Ballinger in 2017, and you came over to the villa, and we sat and talked for a long time, and a lot of what you talked about at that point was how you were struggling with alcohol use and addiction, and how you were trying to prepare and train for Everest. And in your book, you say that addiction is the absence of connection. And you also said that the AA was the process of being chained to the past, which I thought was an interesting comment. But you also said the power of AA is community. So can you talk a little bit more about how you felt your experience with AA and alcohol, and how you would define yourself presently, today, with respect to alcohol?
I mean, this is a really beautiful question, because it drives at the heart of what this book is about, which is storytelling. We're given data, and we interpret it in a certain way. We tell a story about it, gives us meaning, and we design a belief. And that belief directs our behavior. And it all happens like this. And so when it comes to addiction, the way I experienced that is I clearly had a problem with drinking, meaning that I was drinking too much. It was impacting my health. It was impacting my relationships. And I identified that as being an addict, because that was a story I knew from a very young age. It was a story that was reinforced. That was a story of almost inevitability. And so it was a story that I knew, addiction, and I'm an addict. And it was useful because it allowed me to surround myself with a community that helped me move out of the behaviors, right? So that's actually really positive. That's an example of like choosing an identity to help us move beyond something. I choose my words very carefully when I talk about AA, because I don't want to say it saved my life, but I know for some people it does save their lives. All I'm suggesting is that as I've gotten beyond that, now I drink again. I was sober for 6 years. I completely changed my relationship to alcohol and my story surrounding it. But I needed that space. What I'm saying is that oftentimes the stories we tell, as empowering as they might seem, can keep us chained to the things that are actually traumatic or harmful. But that's part of a process, or at least it was for me. So again, if we're constantly telling the story of our trauma, well, guess what? We're constantly living in the story of our trauma. It's wonderful to learn that story. It's important. It's part of the process. But ultimately, for me, if I was constantly going into these rooms and telling people about why I was fucked up and how fucked up I was just staying fucked up. I was sober, but I was just staying fucked up. I'm not suggesting that people that are in the room should change that. I'm not saying
So
any of that.
that's what you're talking about when you say that AA was the process of being chained to the past.
Being chained to my own trauma,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it also gave me community. I think that's the magic of it.
Well, one of the magic things about the comments you made to me was, I've known a lot of people with drinking problems. You know? I've known a lot of people that go to AA. No one's ever told me that having gone through AA, I believe you, but having gone through that and, quote, saying I'm an alcoholic, and then deciding I can control this, and I can have a drink and drink socially and so forth. I find that unusual within my own experience. So I
It is.
think it's fascinating.
And I don't want to suggest, again, I'm not saying that that's the path for people. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that as I started unwinding my own stories, that was one of the ones where I really got curious. Because the story of addict can carry with it a tremendous amount of shame. It's a huge story. Just that word, I am an addict. That's a very different thing than I struggle, or I have historically struggled with substances. One is a journey, one is a declaration. And this is true in everything we say in life. And it's why language is so important, and we don't pay attention to it, is when we say I am, I can't, I won't. That is a powerful story that keeps us trapped.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really interesting and insightful. I think it's a thing for people to think about with respect to their own lives and their own experiences with family members or themselves. But it was the first time I've ever had it articulated that way. So I find that really fascinating. I'm going to jump to something else that goes back to your narcissism.
That's awesome and horrifying, and I'm going to have to call a therapist as soon as I leave.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
am I a narcissist?
There's one in the hall waiting for you. Or actually, Jeff's right up there. Anyway, seriously though, you know, one of the things that you've done a lot of through the years, with this book actually, but also prior, was you were very skilled at self-promotion and helping facilitate things with your sponsors and films and all these things. And I'm sure many people here know about the whole hashtag Hair by Everest thing, which is actually sort of clever.
Yeah.
And what'd you get? 1.5 billion hits or something?
2.5 billion media impressions.
Yeah. So no one knows who you are. And then you do these, you know, other things with Geographic and other films. But as a more specific example, recently for the book, 2 weeks ago you were on Good Morning America, Anderson Cooper, and the Today Show within 3 days or something, right? You've done all these high-end podcasts with people like Alex Honnold at Climbing Gold and Steve House and Uphill Athlete. So it brings me to the question, you know, a lot of us have varying degrees of need for exposure and need for supplying information and photographs and feedback to sponsors. But, you know, some of us just want to go climbing. And maybe we'll talk about it afterwards. You know? So I just wondered how that process has felt for you going through this high level of, you know, promotion and self-flagration in the public arena, and now how you feel about that going forward, now that you're not, as you admitted, not climbing and not being a photographer.
Well, I think that for a long time I just mistaked attention for love, right? And so the more attention I could get, the more love I felt or perceived. And now, like with the book, look, I mean, I view it very much as it's just book promotion, right? It's like that's literally all it is. It doesn't make me feel full to do those things. The attention doesn't make me feel full. It feels, if I can take that opportunity and if I can sell books out of it and spread this message and talk about this idea of breaking the story of broken, which is the whole premise of all of this, great. Let's do it. Let's take that. But I don't feel like that makes me more of a human, right? And to even look back at that and think that I could even confuse those things, it's at one point is kind of heartbreaking. So the visibility is, it's so funny. I don't have Instagram on my phone. people think that I'm always on Instagram. I have that whole system automated. I don't check it. I don't look at it. I don't touch it.
But you post every 3 days.
I don't post. That's a backlog of stuff that my social media person that I hire posts.
Okay. All right. Well, see.
Because
now we're getting to the truth here.
Well, that's the thing. It's all, I mean, I hate to say this, it's all bullshit. And I started to realize that. And this culture of comparison and just like keeping up, and I have to be as good as, and I have to be better than, and I was fucking miserable. And so I don't do it anymore because I realized it was net negative, you know? Mm-hmm. And there's all these, but yeah, I've got to be on it for my business. No, you don't. That is a lie. That is a lie. But I'm happy that I come off as a narcissist anyway. That really...
Just guessing. You know. Well, anyway, let's then talk about, you've had these peaks and valleys, figuratively, throughout this whole 20-year process since you started climbing seriously and were successful with your photography. And, if I may use the analogy, you burn things down time and time again, right? Mm-hmm. It's like you're walking around with a 5-gallon can of gas and a Zippo lighter all the time, ready to just douse it and burn it down. So that brings up this whole topic, I think that's the core of what we're talking about here, which is your mental health and your mental health challenges. But one of the things that I was a little concerned about when I first agreed to do this was, you were Cory, the famous photographer, Cory, the famous climber, and is it now you're Cory, the famous self-described mental health disciple? Is that a fair thing to say, or how would you react? I'm not trying to ask you, put you on the spot.
No.
That was my impression. It's not my impression now.
Well,
okay? But some of us thought, this is just Cory's new shtick,
That's a good question. I think shtick would be, how do I say this? I'm not married to the identity, right? It's something that I'm doing because I think it can have potential impact. Mm-hmm. But I don't find myself identifying with it. And so outwardly, it might be that. It might be interpreted as that. That's okay. If that's how people need to perceive it or it comes off, I'm totally okay with that. All I can communicate is the way I feel internally about this. And the way I feel internally about this is not necessarily that it's a shtick, it's just some level of net positive impact I can potentially have on the world by sharing a story.
Well, I think you've done a really good job. I mean, I learned a lot about the neurobiology, as you call it. I'm sitting there having to actually look shit up,
Yeah.
Like, Jesus, what is this? So it ended up being, I think, a really positive thing. I'm not trying to put you on the spot in that regard.
I think it's a great question.
Yeah, because, we all, I think, are aware of famous athletes, especially in the Olympic arena, people like Simone Biles, the gymnast, and the tennis player, Naomi Osaka, Michael Phelps, the swimmer. They've all now, more recently, become much more public with their mental health challenges and the things that they've learned and are trying to help others. And so I think we never used to talk about this stuff.
Right.
So I think it's timely what you're doing, and I think people that read your book will benefit from that. And so I think you've done a good job of starting whatever it is, whether it's a new phase or a springboard to something else. But I think bringing it out into the arena of especially climbing is, I think, a really positive, brave thing on your part.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
So I'd like to then ask you, since we just talked about the peaks and valleys of you burning things down time and time again, right? Who has stuck with you through thick and thin with all the chaos during your lifetime?
My parents, surprisingly, who took the brunt of it, they've stuck with me Steve and Ann Swenson. You guys have, like, literally a whole life. Adrian Ballinger was one of the people that I climbed with that really stuck with me. Keith Ledzinski, Steve House. There are many people looking back that just sort of accepted it. They didn't excuse it, but they accepted it, and they kept showing up.
Well, I'm anticipating that some of those people had an initial reaction, and then they worked through it, and they talked with you, and then they arrived at where they're at now versus just like that. Was that true? Or
That's very true, and I think also as people, because so often, like with mental health, it's one of those things that you can't really understand, and I don't think you can actually ask for people to understand, but you can ask them to believe. And that's what I'm like, I don't need you to understand the internal experience, just believe me that it's true. And as people, oftentimes when they go through something that's very jarring with somebody that has a mental health complication, it can be very, very like, that's crazy. And then something else in life puts it in perspective, where then they come back and they go, oh, I get it now, because it landed a different way. Maybe it was them that was,
Well, we all interpret things through our own eyes and our own experiences, obviously.
Yeah, and over time it changes, and that's okay. And that's, I think, one of the things that I've had to learn is 100% accountability. There is zero room for saying, well, I have this, ergo X is excusable. That's not what a diagnosis allows. A diagnosis is a label that gives you information and a place to look. Like, I'm bipolar, ergo I get a hall pass for being an asshole? No, right? But so often, especially as mental health and psychology is exploding as a topic, people learn about their diagnosis, whether it's ADHD, anxiety, depression, and then it's their new story, and they hide behind it. And that's not what this is. Like, I say it in the book, psychology is an invitation out of victimhood, not into it. But as soon as we start learning of these labels and we learn the language and we're armchair diagnosing everybody and ourselves, we're pathologically self-obsessed. And it's like, no, that's not what this is. This is meant to be freedom from all of that.
Well, one of the things that you just mentioned, and I think is important that you talk about in the book, is stories and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about that, we all have our own stories. And sometimes we believe what we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes we believe only the stories about other people,
Mm-hmm.
right? So storytelling is actually a huge part of what you talk about in the book. So one of the things that I'd like to ask you to do is read the last paragraph of your book.
The very last one?
The very last one.
This is spoiler alert, right? Like, this is like watching the last minute of Game of Thrones. I think the best stories are the ones where we exit through the same door we entered, different but the same. And I walk into my apartment and look at my life. The watch I wore in Australia sits in a shadow box on top of the small chest. The hand stopped moving almost 20 years ago. Now it reminds me where I've been and my dual obsessions with story and time. A neat braid of purple rope that tied me to Simone and Dennis on Gasherbrum 2 rests next to it. It's the cord that kept me tethered to this life. It bound me and unraveled me, and I wonder if it was always there, hidden in plain sight. I was tied to it when I took the most impactful photograph I've ever made, a portrait of me, which is a portrait of my family, which is a portrait of life cascading over itself as tiny pieces of an explosion that happened 13.8 billion years ago. I look for resolution for all the loose ends, and just as quickly understand that no such thing exists. Resolution is the work of words and the mind. Acceptance is the work of silence and the heart, and the space where all healing takes place. Nothing was ever broken to begin with. Broken was just another story. I am, we all are, unbreakable. All right, still good.
Thanks for doing that.
Thanks, sorry.
No, I'm with you. There's a quote that I've known of, and many people here have known of, that I think is really important at this kind of phase and discussion of topic about, looking forward in your life. And it's a Hemingway quote, and it reads, "Every man has two deaths, when he is buried in the ground and the last time someone says his name." Right? So, my last question to you is, how would you like yourself to be remembered, and what would you like your legacy to be? Even though you're only fucking 43, it's like, come on.
I know,
right?
Annoying. Honestly, just as a good person, just as a kind person, somebody who loved and gave, and that's it. That's it. It's all just stuff. The hat that I'm wearing says, "Holy shit, we're alive." And I love it because this is exactly how I want to be remembered, and it's not concise, but it's not long. It's just all of this stuff, like the stories, the climbing, it was just a way to try to come into contact with the world. And it was a way to go to the edges to feel if I could feel it more completely, because I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. And I always felt this deep hollowness inside of me. And for whatever reason, through this process of learning of myself and trying to give it, not making it about me, but giving it outwardly, I've come into contact with this awareness that, like, holy shit, I'm alive. I have a body that gets to have a headache. I have a mind that gets to be bipolar. I'm wearing a skin suit on a rock spaceship that's going 60,000 miles an hour through space, right? Spinning 1,000 miles an hour on its axis, surrounded by a cascade of atoms that are coming together and forming this like, what the actual fuck? The awareness, just waking up to that and being like, oh my God, this is so marvelous. And what's even more, I don't have to fucking try to matter. I just matter because I'm breathing. And we all matter because we're breathing. And we've built a society that makes us think that we have to do all this shit. And it's so ironic that so often you have to do all this shit to realize it doesn't fucking matter. That's what I want to be remembered for, is just the reminder.
Good answer. All right, I'm just going to finish here with something I think that's fairly obvious. And I think anyone at this point who reads this book of Cory's will relate to the mental health challenges that any of us have faced, either ourselves or within family members or their close friends. And so I thank Cory for his courage to write this book. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good job, Nate.
That was beautiful.
If you enjoyed this interview with Cory Richards, make sure to buy his book, The Color of Everything, at your local bookstore. Join the festivities and help us celebrate 50 years of adventure stories at the heart of the festival here in Banff. Check out our website at banffmountainfestival.ca. This episode was produced by Anique C. and is a production of Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. The theme music was composed by Jacques Blackstone. A special thanks to our audio engineer Ben Ewing and the production team at Banff Centre, as well as the folks from the Paul D. Fleck Library.